This is Geometry Lesson 1.1, Building Blocks of Geometry. So we're going to start with a whole bunch of definitions. The first one here is point. The definition of a point is, it's basically a dot. It's an undefined geometric term technically, but it's thought of as location with no dimension. So what that means is if I have a point like that, that's a point, or there, that's another point, and we can name points with single capital letters. So this could be point A, and this could be point B, and basically those are two different points. Any spot, any place, there's no size to it. The next one is line. A line is another building block. It is a straight, continuous array of points. Basically, it's going to have arrows on both ends because it technically goes on forever. So I'm going to try to cheat a little bit, and a line should look like that. Double arrows on both ends. Bam, that's a line. The way we name lines is using two letters. So I'm going to add some points to this line. I'll put a point here and I'll call that point C. I'll put a point here and I'll call that point D. So then the name of this line is line CD. So that would be CD, and we actually draw a bit of a line on top of that. There should be an arrow on each end showing us that the name of this is line CD. Now there can be lots and lots and lots of points on this line. Like I could have another point here and call that point E. I can have another point here and call that point F. And that's kind of the point, is that there's a whole bunch of points on this thing, but I only want to pick two of them to name it. So I never want to say 3 or 4 or 5 points. You always just pick any two. So I could also say FD, that would be the same line, or I could say EC, that would be the same line. Any 2 points on that, name the line. Next is plane. A plane is a flat, two-dimensional surface. The way that we represent planes in geometry when we're drawing them is usually we use almost like a parallelogram. So we would be drawing this shape here to show that there is just a flat surface there. But any flat surface is a plane. So the wall is a plane, the floor you're standing on is a plane. Any flat surface is a plane. And the way that we name those is generally with a cursive letter. So I'm going to try to write a cursive letter P on here, so the name of that is plane P. Next is segment. Now segment and actually the next word ray are both parts of lines. So a part of a line with 2 endpoints. So if I were just going to look at the piece of this line between C and F, that would be a segment. Or the point of this line between E and F, that would be a different segment. So it's just a little piece of that line. And I'm going to try to cheat a little bit again to make sure my line looks pretty straight, but it would basically look like that. So sometimes you would see these points really, really defined on the ends here, and sometimes they wouldn't be really defined there. But I'm going to, I think, draw them on a little bit nicer. So there is a point on this end, and I'll call that point P. And a point on this end, and I'll call that point Q. So then the name of this segment would be PQ. And just like when we named our line CD, when we name our segment PQ, we're going to add this little symbol on top just so that we know it's a segment. So I'm talking about the piece of the line between P and Q, not anything beyond P or anything beyond Q. And even if there were, 2 or 3 other points on this line, let's say there was a J here, it's still going to be segment PQ because it's the whole piece of the line between P and Q. And then array is another part of a line, and it's specifically a part of the line that has one endpoint and one arrow point. A part of a line that is continuous on one end. So basically it has one endpoint and one arrow end. So I have my handy dandy shapes up here, and that would look like, I think I picked the wrong one. That would look like this guy. So it's going to have an arrow on one end, and it's going to have an endpoint or no arrow on the other end. And just like before, there can be infinitely many points on this ray. There's definitely an endpoint. There has to be an endpoint, but there can be 2 or 3 or 4 other points on here, and we can name all of them. Let's just go in order. Here's A, here's B, here's C, here's D, and when I'm naming it, I just want to pick any 2 points. I don't want to use all the points. I definitely have to use the endpoint. I had to use P and I had to use Q because those are the endpoints. I didn't have to use J. I have to use A because that's an endpoint, and then I can pick any other point I want to. I can say AB, I can say AC, I can say AD. As long as I use the endpoint, the other letter in the name can be anything we want it to be. So let's try naming and classifying some of these figures using some of these definitions. So the first one says classify and name the figure in 2 ways. So if I'm looking at this picture here, picture A, I know that that is a line because I see arrows on both ends. So I'm going to type line. And I also know that the name of this line is line AB. But it also asks me to name it in 2 ways. So I'm also going to say that this could be called line BA. So forwards and backwards, it doesn't change the name, AB versus BA. I just have to say it one or each point on the line, and I only want to use 2 points. So sometimes there's 3 points, 4 points, 5 points named, but you always still only want to pick 2. Now I should also have my symbols on there. That's going to be a little harder for me to type, so I'm going to try just drawing that on. Because I know it's a line, I should have the double arrow symbol on the top to tell me that it is line AB and line BA. For figure B, I see a endpoint on one end and I see an arrow on the other end, so I know that this is a ray. Rays have an endpoint and an arrow end. Now when we're naming, we always have to use endpoints. So my ray name is definitely going to start with X. One possible name would be XY. The other possible name would be XZ. So direction does matter on this one. I cannot say ZX. That would technically be if I had like a ray that started at Z and moved past the X. That would be ray ZX, not ray XZ. So I don't want to say that. I definitely have to start with the endpoint, and then I would say XY, or I would say XZ. And just like with the line, I need to add my little one-way arrow on the top telling me that that is ray XY and ray XZ. Figure C, I want to know what shape that is, and I know that that is a segment. I know that it's a segment. It's a piece of a line because it has 2 endpoints. And when I'm naming that, I always want to use 2 letters, and I always want to use endpoints. So one possible name would be BN. The other possible name would be NB. I don't want to use the E. That's a point in the middle of the segment, not an endpoint on the segment. And then last on that one would be the symbol. So because it is a segment, I'm just going to add a little line on top and a little line on top telling me that it's segment BN or segment NB. Example B says draw and label the figure. Part A has the letters J and P and then a one-way arrow on top. So I know it's asking me to draw a ray because it's got a one-way arrow. So I'm going to actually try and draw it. So I'm going to have an endpoint and then I'm going to have an arrow side. On the first endpoint, I definitely need the letter J because the J comes first here. And then anywhere else on the ray, I can add a point and call that P. Now, it could be pointing another way. I'm going to draw one more just for fun. So maybe it's pointing this direction, and the J is still going to be further on the right now, just because of the direction it's pointing. But we definitely need to have the end point be the J, and then the point closer to the arrow be the P. Figure B says line MN. I know it's a line because I see arrows on both ends. So I'm going to draw an arrowy end and an arrowy end. And this one doesn't matter with lines. I can put the N first or I can put the M first. It doesn't make a difference. We just need to have each point labeled MN or NM, same thing. And figure C says PQ with a little line on plane R. So this means I need to draw plane R. That's going to be any flat surface. Bam, bam, bam. There's my flat surface. And I'm going to throw on my cursive letter R to show that the plane's name is R. And then this is a segment. I know it's a segment because I have no arrows on there. So I'm going to draw a segment, and I'm going to make sure that endpoint is obvious, and I'll call that endpoint P. And this point, I'll make that more obvious, and I will call that segment endpoint letter Q. So he got a little smushed, but hopefully we can see we have segment. We have two pointy ends, no arrow ends. And then we have a cursive R, and that would be it. Good luck on these exercises. Please let me know if you have any questions.